Thanks for coming out here and watching us tonight on this cold night. Just give us a few minutes. We're going to wait for everybody to kind of file in, and then I go ahead and start the program. So sit tight. We'll start in a minute. So hello to everybody that's out there. Just give us a few minutes. We're going to wait till everybody gets logged in and into our room. So just give us a few minutes and we'll get started here in a minute. Okay, I think I'll go ahead and get started. So hello to everybody out there. Thanks for joining us tonight. I'm Derek. I'm one of the reference librarians here. A couple little announcements before I introduce the author. So on Wednesday, January 18th, via Zoom at 7 o'clock, we're going to have Gina Davis, and she's going to be talking about her latest book, Dying of Politeness, a memoir. So join us on January 18th at 7 p.m. Also, January 30th, which is a Monday at 7 p.m., we're going to have journalist Mary Beth Albright, and she has written a book called Eat and Flourish, How Food Supports Emotional Well-Being. And one other thing, we're going to have a live program that is in the library, our first one of the year. It is Monday, February 20th. We're going to have best-selling author James Rollins, and he's going to be talking about his newest science fiction book, The Cradle of Ice. So if you're interested in any of those programs, go to hudsonlibrary.org to sign up. So we'd like to thank the Learned Owl for providing copies of this wonderful book, which we're going to hear about in a minute. So there'll be a link in our Q&A that'll explain how to get the book. That is our local bookseller, the Learned Owl. So one other thing before I can start here, we're going to have time tonight for questions. So don't be shy. At the Q&A at the bottom, there's going to be a slot there. You can go ahead and ask some questions. So without further ado, let's introduce our author. So tonight we have Daphne Geanacopoulos, and she's going to be talking to us about Pirate's Wife, which is a wonderful book. And she has her doctoral of liberal studies degree and a master of liberal studies degree from Georgetown Universities. She's author of a book called The Pirate Next Door, The Untold Story of 18th Century Pirates' Wives, Families, and Communities. And she is a journalist with over 40 articles in newspapers and magazines such as New York Times, Washington Post, Southern Living, and Virginia Business, as well as other ones. And she's coming to us live from Massachusetts. So I'll turn it over to the author.
Thank you, Derek, for that nice introduction. And I'd like to thank Gwen Mayer for the invitation to give this book talk tonight at the Hudson Library Historical Society. I'm really delighted to be here with you by Zoom. It's the next best thing to being in person, but I do look forward to visiting the Hudson area, your library, and the Learned Owl bookstore. I'm very grateful for the opportunity to speak with you tonight about a book I've been working on for many years. It's the first ever direct account of the life of Sarah Kidd, the wife of the notorious pirate Captain William Kidd. Sarah lived a long and storied life, and I'm going to give you a glimpse into it. I'm going to show you some slides and do a reading from my book. I hope you all will find Sarah Kidd to be easily as interesting and remarkable as her famous husband. Generations of readers the world over have known the story of Captain William Kidd, the noble sea captain and privateer who turned ruthless pirate. The history of the Golden Age of Piracy, in which Kidd played an outsized part, is replete with the exploits of pirates of many stripes, who hoisted the black flag and prowled the seas, attacking 17th and 18th century merchant vessels bound for the West Indies, West Africa, and North America. Kidd's story is particularly striking. In 1699, Captain Kidd became the subject of a deadly political scandal involving top officials on both sides of the Atlantic, including the King of England. There was a worldwide chase, and eventual conviction and execution at the hands of colonial officials who may have been complicit in Kidd's darkest acts of piracy. It was a drama laced with lies, secrets, double dealing, betrayal, and buried treasure. The story of his journey from privateer to murderous pirate has been immortalized across the centuries, in print, on stage and screen, in video games, and even in an epic 22-verse ballad. But our understanding of his legend is incomplete. What is largely unknown is that Kidd had a partner, an accomplice, a behind-the-scenes player who enabled his plundering and helped him outpace his enemies. This accomplice was his wife, the English-born Sarah Kidd, a young, well-to-do New York socialite whose extraordinary life is a lesson in reinvention and resourcefulness. Sarah was running a thriving merchant business in the New York City area when she met Captain Kidd. The encounter set off a high-octane romance that often operated outside the law. While Captain Kidd was plundering the high seas, Sarah Kidd was pirating in her own way, within the confines of polite society, working to ensure that her husband never got caught and that the location of his buried treasure stayed secret. With bold determination to survive and protect her husband, Sarah secretly aided and abetted her husband, fighting alongside him against his accusers. The most impressive part is that even after Captain Kidd was put to death for his crimes, Sarah remained an incredibly beloved figure, securing a long and prosperous life for herself and her family. Sarah knew how to persuade, and she knew how to hustle. And in a time when women held little legal power, she found a way to ensure her future and protect her family. But for more than 300 years, the story of Sarah Kidd has been all but erased from history. My journey into the world of pirates began in 2002, when I was commissioned by the New York Times to write a freelance piece for their museum's special section about the Whydah Pirate Museum in Provincetown, Cape Cod. The museum contains artifacts recovered from the Whydah pirate ship that crashed during a fierce nor'easter off the coast of Wellfleet, Cape Cod in 1717. Prior to writing this article, I didn't know much about pirates, except what I had read in books and seen in movies. I thought all pirates had a pet parrot, like Long John Silver in Robert Louis Stevenson's Treasure Island, or looked like the handsome and fit Errol Flynn in the 1935 movie Captain Blood, or more recently, walked, talked, and wore eyeshadow like Jack Sparrow in the movies Pirates of the Caribbean. Looking at the everyday artifacts recovered from the pirate ship, silver coins, cutlery, pewter plates, a teapot with the shoulder blade of a pirate, pistols, cannon, navigational instruments, medical supplies, and even a size 5 shoe, leg bone, and silk stocking, I realized that these mythological figures were mere ordinary men. The legend of the captain, Samuel Bellamy, and his love interest, Maria Hallett, told me that pirates had connections on land. They had families and community links that we don't know much about. As I was researching my dissertation turned previous book, The Pirate Next Door, The Untold Story of 18th Century Pirates' Wives, Families, and Communities, I kept encountering evidence of this mysterious woman who seemed oddly on the periphery of the story of the notorious Captain Kidd. Even the influential and authoritative early source book on pirates, called A General History of the Robberies and Murders of the Most Notorious Pirates, by Captain Charles Johnson did not include Sarah in the lengthy chapter on Captain Kidd. Sarah was alive at the time that book was published in London in 1724, and it would have been possible for the author to interview her or people who knew her. Sarah's initials, SK, scratched on a colonial document at an archive in Boston, started me on a thrilling journey to learn more about her. I would soon learn that her initials marked the spot where love and law divide. To research Sarah's story, I had to use a variety of sources because women left little record of their affairs. Most women, including Sarah, could not write. Men owned all the property and exercised most of the legal rights at the time. I read the contextual history of pirates and of the time period to learn the political, economic, and cultural events that shaped Sarah's life. I was able to find some important primary sources of Sarah's, such as her petition to regain her seized property from the governor of New York, Lord Belmont, and her last will and testament. Many of the ancient sources that I relied on were handwritten, and I transcribed over 250 of them to make them easier to work with. I visited archives in the places Sarah and Captain Kidd had been, including those in New York, Boston, and Rhode Island. I traced Sarah's steps in the surroundings she visited, especially in Manhattan, where she spent most of her life. I also found great resources in the Admiralty papers in the National Archives in London. I found a rich cache of letters that were in a sea chest in Captain Samuel Burgess's pirate ship when it was captured by a British privateer in 1699. The letters were in the pirate's mailbag and contained a few letters from Captain Kidd's crewmen aboard the Adventure galley to their wives, and from the wives to Kidd's crewmen. The letters are dated from 1695 through 1699, and they show that correspondence was conducted thousands of miles across the globe between the Indian Ocean pirates and North American colonists, and that there was successful and direct communications between New York and Madagascar and back again. No letters from Sarah and Captain Kidd were among these letters, and none have survived, but there is every likelihood that they communicated during his 3-year voyage through the Mariner's Mail Service, which was located on Ascension's Island, a remote outpost in the Atlantic. New York merchant captains trading with the pirates in Madagascar stopped there for supplies of fresh turtle meat, and they dropped off and collected the mail that was left under a rock with a hole in it near the harbor. This letter was from the wife of one of Kidd's crewmen named Jacob Horn, and it was especially helpful and informative. Writing from their home in Flushing, New York, on June 5th, 1698, Sarah Horn told her husband, quote, "We hear an abundance of flying news about you." This meant that word had spread from port to port and ship to ship, and that there was trouble aboard the Adventure galley. That trouble, we would later learn, was murder, mutiny, and piracy. To further understand the maritime world in which Captain Kidd was a part of, I attended a workshop at the National Archives and conducted research with scholars from the Prize Papers Project, a collaborative effort of the National Archives with the University of Oldenburg in Germany to research and categorize the thousands of yet unopened documents captured by the British in wartime in the 17th and 18th centuries. I examined trial records, depositions, personal correspondence, ship's logs, cargo inventories, and even a mariner's personal journal that was worn softly in the leather from the wear in his front pocket. The manuscript room at the Library of Congress was a terrific resource, and Captain Kidd's own statements gave valuable and strong evidence of their relationship. Archivists and other historians I met were enthusiastic and helpful about my research, as was my trusty research assistant, Higgins, a Cavalier King Charles Spaniel named for a runaway pirate, Jeremiah Higgins. Here he is inspecting the galleys of the pirate's wife. Unfortunately, there are no contemporary paintings of Sarah Kidd, so she can't be seen that way. But in 1911, the artist Jean-Léon Jérôme Frère created this painting of Captain Kidd in New York Harbor. The attractive, beautifully dressed woman with a lace fan holding Captain Kidd's hand on the deck of his ship is an interesting rendition of a woman who has captured Kidd's attention. One contemporary of Sarah's described her as lovely and accomplished, and the woman in this painting is certainly lovely. Kidd's velvet knee-length coat, a sword at his side, and a tri-cornered hat are historically accurate depictions of the attire of the period and what he would have worn as a successful sea captain. His gesture towards his lovely visitor, a suave, gentlemanly bow, and a warm clasp of her hand, fits the charming demeanor he was known to display. While this painting is a figment of the artist's imagination, and in 1911 we do not know the story of Captain Kidd and Sarah, there is coincidentally some historical resemblance of truth in it. Born Sarah Bradley around 1670, the future pirate's wife arrived in New York from England with her widowed father and two brothers when she was 14 years old. At 15, she was married to one of the richest men in the colony, a much older, wealthy New York merchant named William Cox. When Cox died tragically 4 years later in 1689, Sarah was 19 years old. She married a year later a Dutch merchant and mariner named John Ort. It was then when she met Captain Kidd during a chance encounter on a land transaction. Captain Kidd was a well-respected gentleman with whom she began a friendship. Captain Kidd was Sarah's third husband. Sarah was a twice widowed 21-year-old, considered one of the most eligible and sought-after women in New York when she and Kidd married just 2 days after her second husband's death. While the circumstances might appear suspect for Sarah and Kidd to marry so soon after her second husband's untimely demise, Kidd and Sarah were stellar members of polite New York society. They were New York's power couple. No untoward behavior was ever proved. At the time of their marriage, the well-built, well-dressed 37-year-old sea captain, who spoke with a hint of a Scottish accent, was one of the most respected men in Manhattan. He was a celebrated war hero and sought-after privateer. A privateer was hired by the government to legally plunder and seize enemy ships. He was a legal pirate. During wartime, the resources of warring countries were stretched to the limit, and privateers were extra hired hands who owned their own armed vessel and served as an auxiliary to England's navy. A privateer's assignment was detailed in a document called a letter of marque and reprisal. He had investors, and the captured prizes and cargo was shared with his investors. The captain and the crew got a smaller proportion of the take. There was sometimes a fine line between a legal privateer and an outlaw pirate. Many a privateer, once out at sea and beyond the reach of the authorities, turned pirate to avoid having to share the loot. There were other reasons for turning pirate. Turning pirate was an attractive alternative for some men, especially those with wives and families, because pirates lived in a highly civilized democratic society. They were paid well when the going was good, and they were treated fairly. Pirates lived by a set of rules called articles, and each pirate had to sign his name, or if he could not write, to leave his mark as an X to join the crew of a pirate ship. With that commitment to join the ship and to be true to his fellow brethren of the coast came benefits. Each pirate had an equal vote, and most were given an equal share of the booty. There was a form of health insurance, life insurance, and retirement benefits. The pirate community was designed to support and maintain their relationships on land while they were at sea. For example, if a pirate died in action, his share of the booty was smuggled halfway around the world and given to his family. There was honor among thieves. Turning pirate was a risky and dangerous choice, but for some men, they chose a merry life and a short one, and they made that their motto. Sarah and Kid's wedding took place in Manhattan on a rainy Saturday, May 16th, 1691. It was a day of high drama and grisly 17th century justice. England was at war with France. Pirates were plundering the high seas, and two traitors, the self-appointed Jacob Leicester and his son-in-law, Jacob Milborne, were hanged for treason against King William and Queen Mary in the public square. Sarah and Kid attended the hanging after their wedding. A public hanging was an event everyone turned out for. It was a carnival-like source of entertainment. The stark contrast of the day, a love match and an execution, foreshadowed the dark drama that would be their life together. The Kids lived in a mansion Sarah inherited from her first husband, located on the corner of Pearl and Hanover Street in the Hanover Square neighborhood of Manhattan. The waterfront property faced a wall, now called Wall Street, in the financial district of Manhattan. Coincidentally, their home was just a few blocks from the offices of my publisher, Hanover Square Press, an imprint of HarperCollins. I like to think Sarah found my publisher for me. Around 1692, Sarah gave birth to a daughter, Elizabeth, and in 1694, she had another daughter, little Sarah. During the colonial period, giving birth was a social and bonding event where women looked after one another. Sarah's babies would have been born at home in a separate area away from the main living quarters. Men were not involved in the birthing process, so Captain Kidd would have been busy elsewhere. It was the job of women, relatives, neighbors, friends, and elders in the colony to act as midwives to assist in the delivery. Special birthing linens were prepared and laid out. Sarah would have used a birthing stool, or perhaps a loved one held her upright and supported her as she progressed through labor. In the early stages, Sarah would have acted as the hostess of the festive occasion. It was an old English tradition for new mothers to serve food called groaning cakes, a sweet, nutritious baked good that was made of spices, molasses, rum, apples, and carrots. And she also served groaning beer. As they waited for the blessed moment, the women would entertain themselves with gossip, jokes, and stories. In 1696, Captain Kidd was given a dream job, 2 privateering commissions from the King, William III. His investors were some of the most important men in England, including the newly appointed governor of New York and Massachusetts, Richard Coote, called Lord Belmont. Belmont's complicated relationship with Kidd would lead to Kidd's tragic downfall. In his brand new ship that looked like this, the Adventure Galley was a 287-ton warship with 3 tall masts, square rigged sails, and 34 big guns. It was a hybrid ship called a galley, meaning that it could be rowed as well as sailed. His job was to hunt French enemy ships to rid the seas of pirates who disrupted international trade. His commissions were for 1 year. His initially unsuccessful voyage led to frustration, mutiny, and eventually Kidd's turn to piracy. Sarah was key to Kidd's fight for his life against the men who accused him of turning from privateer to pirate. She and their daughters spent time with Kidd on his pirate ship, and Sarah helped Kidd hide his stolen treasure. As an accomplice to an outlaw, she was arrested and imprisoned with him in Boston. Once released, Sarah helped construct the narrative Captain Kidd presented in his defense. She ensured he was taken care of in jail. She worked tirelessly to help secure a pardon, and she even tried to help plan an escape. After Kidd was executed in 1701, Sarah lived another 40 years. She reinvented herself, and she managed to go from one half of a criminal outlaw couple back to a high society socialite. She secured her family's inheritance, remarried, had more children, and lived the rest of her life as a prominent and respectable citizen. She even learned how to write her full name. Sarah's extraordinary life is a rare example of the kind of life that pirates' wives lived during the Golden Age of Piracy. Hers is a tale of love, marriage, motherhood, and survival. Sarah's life, and particularly her transformation from a New York socialite to a stateless outlaw, sheds new light on the political, economic, and cultural events of the late 17th and 18th centuries. From her, we learn about the economic hardships of widowhood, the political repercussions of piracy, the effects of war on the new and emerging colonial economies, the business of slavery. Her life tells a broader story about how certain women were able to assert their will and reclaim their agency within the oppressive strictures of colonial America. During her 74 years, Sarah lived through 7 British monarchs, 21 New York governors, and she experienced firsthand the Golden Age of Piracy. She survived 4 husbands and 3 of her 5 adult children. The Pirate's Wife, the remarkable true story of Sarah Kidd, recasts the image of Captain Kidd from a diabolical pirate to a flawed but decent man who tried to please his investors and protect his wife and family. He was a pirate, but he was not one with a black heart. Sarah's initials, scratched on a few colonial documents, gave clues to her existence. Those bold pen strokes reveal a history we have only imagined, the dangerous, difficult, and thrilling life of a pirate's wife. They shed unexpected light on a young colonial woman caught up in a world of politics, passion, and grisly 18th century justice. The unknown SK is finally identified. She is Sarah Kidd, the First Lady of Pirates. I'd like to close by reading a passage from The Pirate's Wife. This is the prologue. Sarah Kidd laid in a weakened state in the bedroom of her Manhattan mansion. A highly contagious lethal disease raged through the colony, striking young and old, rich and poor, black or white. It was September 12th, 1744, and the 74-year-old Sarah had first taken to her bed to get warm under her soft quilts and to rest her head on the goose down pillows. When the chills, fever, and fatigue set in, she was nearly certain she had contracted the deadly disease everyone called diphtheria. As a precaution, she asked her family and friends to stay at a safe distance. She arranged for soft foods and a soothing drink made from the medicinal herbs in her garden to be left outside her bedroom door. Her mind wandered in a fever-induced haze. She closed her eyes and remembered herself in another time and place. She was a young woman with her husband, Captain William Kidd, on his pirate ship, the Saint Antonio, a vessel laden with gold, silver, and jewels. As his closest confidant, she learned that he had buried some of his stolen treasure for safekeeping, and he described to her where it was hidden. She was not to tell a soul. For more than 40 years since his death in 1701, Sarah the pirate's wife kept his secret safe. Not even her 5 children knew. She alluded to it in her will, noting that she had assets in the city of New York and elsewhere. She did not identify elsewhere. Sarah worried about the consequences if her children were caught with stolen pirate loot. Her strong instincts told her it was best to leave well enough alone. As she thought back over her life, not all of her memories were fond ones, especially the time when she was a pirate's wife. But now the memory of those hardships and heartbreak had softened, and Sarah wouldn't have traded it for anything. She felt proud, very proud, to have been a pirate's wife, and she wore the title as a badge of honor. Sarah repeated a prayer as her condition worsened. Almighty God, have mercy on my soul and pardon and forgive me all my sins and offenses, so that I may, after this miserable life, arise with our Savior, Jesus Christ. She became delirious from the fever and shook uncontrollably. The sheets were soaked with her perspiration. Still, the thought of that secret weighed on her, as well-kept secrets do. As she prayed for forgiveness, she may have thought it was time to identify elsewhere to her 3 children who paced downstairs in the sitting room. It wasn't long before Sarah developed a sore throat that felt like a razor when she swallowed. She tried to speak, but it hurt so much she could only whisper. Her daughter, Elizabeth Kidd Troop, peeked through the keyhole to check on Sarah. The once vigorous woman now appeared very small among the many furnishings and tasseled curtains. She looked pale in her white cotton bedclothes and so frail, lying on her side, facing the door. Elizabeth saw her mother's lips moving, mouthing words, but she could not hear her. She strained through the keyhole to see and hear what might be happening. Elizabeth called for her brothers, William and Henry, who had stepped outside on the front stoop that faced the harbor. The cry of the seagulls seemed to signal the alarm. Elizabeth told them to hurry. Each took a turn at the keyhole, looking and listening. Sarah's breathing was loud and strained as she gasped for air. The three of them looked at each other with tears in their eyes when the room fell quiet. There was not a sound, not even a whisper. For over 300 years, treasure hunters have scoured the North American eastern seaboard, trying to find where elsewhere is. That secret is with Sarah, buried in the churchyard of Trinity Church, Wall Street in Manhattan. Thank you.
Okay, well, I think we'll go ahead and start taking some questions here. So the first question is, you mentioned Sarah had 5 children. Were all those with William Kidd, or were they previous marriages?
No, she had 4 marriages, and she had her first set of children with Captain Kidd, her third husband, those 2 daughters, and then she married again a gentleman named Christopher Rousby, a merchant from East Jersey, and she had 3 sons with him.
So you mentioned that there wasn't a lot of, we'll just call it a lack of narrative for Sarah. She didn't really pop up too much in primary sources. How did you construct her story and give her a voice?
I had to go to a lot of different sources, but she did leave a trail. She left a very strong trail because she lived so long, and because she married 4 times, and because her third husband was one of the most recorded men of the late 17th, early 18th century. There are hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of documents on Captain Kidd. And as I explained how I put it together, it was like putting together a 10,000 piece puzzle. And how I work is I put all of the facts together on a timeline, and then I break it into chapters, and I write each chapter, and then I often have to go back and do more research to get more information to explain more about Sarah's life. And it was a very natural arc that she had in her life. And there was plenty of information for me to construct it.
Okay, so the next question has to do with, I've heard this a few times, the Golden Age of Piracy. Why was this time known as that? And then also a follow-up question, what happened to the Golden Age of Piracy? Why did it go away?
So the Golden Age of Piracy was a name coined because there were so many pirates plundering the high seas. And at one point, there was nearly 5,000 pirates. And the period lasted from about 1680 to about 1725-ish. And the reason it ended is because the monarchy cracked down on piracy. They established admiralty courts, vice admiralty courts in the colonies, so that pirates could be tried, convicted, and executed much more rapidly.
So one of the things you mentioned in the book is, I've never heard this term before, but you called a she merchant. I've never heard of that before. And you were talking about Sarah in the beginning. Can you kind of talk a little bit about what that is, in case some of our viewers out there haven't read your book yet?
Sure. A she merchant is a woman merchant. And Sarah, with her first husband, opened up a retail store selling imported dry goods from Europe, especially England. And they sold them out of the first floor of their house in Manhattan, which is what many, many colonists did who were merchants. Their shop was on the first floor of their home. So Sarah was operating this retail business with her husband. So she was a she merchant.
Whoops, there we go. Wonderful. So another thing I was reading in your book is, I found it really interesting, is I've never really heard too much more about William Kidd. Obviously, that he was a pirate and things of that nature, but it sounded like we would use the term railroaded. I don't know if that's a right comparison, but it sounded like he was kind of made as an example, especially by Britain, and tried. Do you kind of feel that is true? Like that's why they tried him in England as opposed to back in the colonies?
Well, at the time, he was imprisoned in Boston, and Massachusetts did not have jurisdiction to try pirates. So the reason that Captain Kidd was shipped to London was so that he could be tried. Was he railroaded? I believe he was. I truly believe he was used as a scapegoat because of his investors. His investors were such high-profile men, including the king, and they were secret investors, and they didn't want anyone to know that they were profiting from the war. So they made him the bad guy. But many pirates were pardoned for their transgressions. And at the time that Captain Kidd was imprisoned in London and awaiting trial, and then during his trial, the king had authorized a pardon, a general pardon to all pirates, that he would forgive them of their sins, so to speak, if they promised never to return to their evil ways. Sarah was very hopeful, as was Captain Kidd, that he would be pardoned, but his name was specifically listed as a man who would not be pardoned. So he was, there was no way he was going to be able to get out of this. He presented evidence to show that he had acted as a privateer. He had 2 French passes, which French passes are the registration on a ship. And he had captured 2 French ships, which were within the instructions of his privateering commission. So he was acting legally. Those 2 French passes conveniently were lost. So they were not able to be used as evidence in his trial in London. And that really was his downfall. And ironically, it was in the 1920s, I believe, these 2 French passes were found in a file in London.
Wow, that's amazing. So we have an interesting question here. Somebody is asking, are there any descendants living today of Sarah Kidd? Did you know of?
Not that I know of. And I looked. I very much wanted to find someone so that I could interview them. But it was a very long time ago, and I just wasn't able to find any. I do know that her descendants continued to use Trinity Church, which was the church that Captain Kidd helped build in Manhattan on Wall Street. And that was Sarah's place of worship. They owned a pew there, pew number 4. And Sarah's descendants on her daughter's side continued to worship at the church until about 1800, when the records go cold.
Interesting. So I was interested about this in the beginning. It talked about that piracy or privateering, whichever you want to call it, was very beneficial to the colonies, which I didn't realize that. Why is that? You would think you wouldn't really want to advertise, but a lot of the items that were taken as a prize were sort of sold back or bought by some of the merchants. That's fascinating. I never would have thought of that.
Yes, who would have thought that piracy was good for the economy? But it certainly was. And under Governor Benjamin Fletcher, he was very encouraging to pirates to come to New York, because the economy in New York was really failing because Britain was at war with France. So the colonies were not even getting any attention from the British authorities. And he was trying to rejuvenate the colony, and pirates brought in goods, as you said, Derek. They bring in goods from faraway places, and they're very exotic and very sought after. And the pirates had just about no overhead, so they could sell them cheap to the merchants, and the merchants could mark them up for a very nice profit and make a nice livelihood. And it helped juice up the economy in New York, because it meant that if you had merchants who were prospering, then they could develop more businesses, they could build new houses, they could, just develop an infrastructure. But the thing is that Governor Fletcher was personally benefiting from the pirates coming in. He charged them a fee to get in the harbor in exchange for not arresting them. And that fee went right into his pocket. So he became a pretty wealthy man until it was found out what he was doing. And then he was replaced. And he was replaced with Governor Belmont, or Lord Belmont, who was the governor of New York and Massachusetts, who had the directive from the British authorities to stamp out piracy.
So we have a question asked, was Sarah involved in any way with selling either the pirated goods or the items that were taken prize by the colony?
She was involved in the fact that she helped disperse them. When she was on Captain Kidd's pirate ship, they were moored right outside of Gardiner's Island, which is a small island in Long Island Sound. And Captain Kidd had a ship full of treasure, and he had notified a number of his colleagues, mariner colleagues, who came to his ship, and they were offloading the treasure to distribute it in different places. Because Captain Kidd had a strategy that he and Sarah concocted, which is that if he distributed all the treasure, that he would be able to wrangle a pardon out of Lord Belmont. And see, the complicated relationship he had with Lord Belmont was, Lord Belmont was hired by the king to stamp out piracy, but Lord Belmont was one of his largest investors. So Captain Kidd thought that as his investor, he would have a very big interest in having some of this treasure. But it didn't turn out that way. But to answer the question, which is a really terrific question, is Sarah Kidd was a part of it in that she sorted, she packed, she put it in bags, she put it in trunks, she offloaded it to ships. She did not sell it, as far as I know. I don't know that any of it was sold.
Interesting. So now that you have 2 books, what made you want to become an author? Was it your love of history or your writing background? What made you kind of embark on that?
To become an author? Well, as a journalist, I've always been a writer, and I fell into this really by accident. And it was when I was writing a number of pieces for the New York Times as a freelancer, especially about Cape Cod. And when I was commissioned to do this piece for the museum's special section on pirates, that's what led me to find that they were really very interesting and compelling. And once I saw some of their personal articles, I just thought, these men, they had mothers and fathers and maybe siblings and friends, and who are they? And they must have had relations on land, and who was that, and where were they? And it just led me down this trail, which I never expected to be on, quite frankly. And my first book, as I mentioned, was my dissertation, which I completely rewrote from an academic piece into a trade piece. It was in writing that first book that I discovered Sarah. So that led to my second book, and there'll be more.
So we have a question about Captain Kidd when he was essentially on the sea. Where did he go and capture ships or capture prizes? Was it around the colony? Was it around the Atlantic? And was he looking for anything in particular, or was just whatever was on the ship?
So he was in the Indian Ocean, and he was trying to capture French enemy ships. And that's what he was interested in, anything that was on the ship. And as a privateer, he was hired to capture the ship, take the cargo, and bring the ship back to London so it would be considered a prize, and the goods would be then distributed to the investors. So he was interested initially as for only French enemy ships, but Captain Kidd's commission, which was for 1 year, lagged on, and that is because after 1 year he didn't find any ships. He didn't capture any prizes, and so he extended his voyage another year, and then after 2 years he still didn't have much to show for his time, and he extended it to a third year. At this point, his men were mutinous because they had been at sea for 3 years with very little to show for it. And that's when he became, he lacked discretion on what he would take. He would take anything. And well, he ran into problems when he took the East India ships. And, they were part of, one of them was his investor. The head of the East India Company was his investor. So that was really his downfall. That was when things really went south.
Okay, we have time for a few more questions. We talked a little bit about before the program, but somebody wants to know what's next for you on the horizon. Any projects, any books, anything you're thinking about?
Well, certainly there's many projects. I'm tinkering around with of 2 or 3 ideas. I haven't settled on one. I haven't got a book contract for my next book yet. I write about women lost in history. It will definitely be about women lost in history. I'm very comfortable and knowledgeable about the 17th and 18th century, so it may be about that. It will be about an underdog, about a woman we've never heard about, but we should, and we need to be aware of her circumstances, her children, her families. I'll keep you posted.
Okay, we're all looking forward to it. So we have
Thank
a
you.
question, and I was actually going to ask this too, but somebody was interested in, so he talked about when somebody was kind of like a social aspect when they were giving birth, and there was this kind of cake and beer. How did you find out about that?
So there's a lot of information about colonial life, and there was even some old English recipe books from the time period, and those were books that perhaps Sarah's mother even used as during Sarah's time. So that's how I found out about it. There's a lot of information about what life was like in the colonial period.
Okay, and this is the final question. I'm surprised somebody didn't ask this, but I'm going to go ahead and ask it. So did pirates really bury treasure? You kind of talked a little bit about this in the book, but they did they? And if they didn't, what did they do with their hidden treasure or booty?
So they really did. And Captain Kidd really did. He buried it on Gardiner's Island, buried some of it on Gardiner's Island. And Gardiner's Island is a place where it's another small island off of Long Island Sound. And he buried treasure there. And then when he was imprisoned in Boston, Lord Belmont found out that there was buried treasure on Gardiner's Island. And so he sent a messenger to Gardiner's Island who met with the owner of the island and the owner told him where it was, because the owner knew where it was, because the owner had been holding some treasure for Captain Kidd too. And so he went and took him to the place where it was, and it was dug up, and it was transported back to Boston. And eventually it was transported back to London with Captain Kidd and on a ship. When Captain Kidd was shipped back to London with pirates to be imprisoned and taken to trial, the treasure went with it.
Wow, fascinating. Well, thank you so much for taking the time to talk to us about your newest book. We all enjoyed your program here.
Thank you so much, Derek. It's a real treat, and I'm just delighted to be here, and I'd love to come back again.
Okay, we'd love to have you. So take care, and thanks for everybody for coming out tonight.
Thank you, everybody. Good night.
Night.